Hey everybody, welcome to the show. Today I'm delighted to have Honor Phillips, who is an American who is the part of the board of the Ukraine Story, which is a non-profit doing work in Ukraine. So welcome to the show today, Honor.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
So as an American, what is your interest in what is going on in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for starters, like you said, my name is Honor Phillips. I work with a documentary foundation called Ukraine Story, and we produce documentary film shorts and get stories out about the individuals and the human stories unfolding in Ukraine. We also do writing and analytical work on the important issues unfolding in relation to the war. Back, well, first off, I come from a family in America which is very invested in the American story of liberty and freedom and the implications of what that means for Americans and for the world. Both my father and my grandfather were heavily involved before the fall of the Soviet Union in combating Soviet expansionism and fighting for maintaining what I would say are sort of the founding principles of American freedom in that's a air raid siren on my phone actually from Ukraine.
Thanks for having that on
Um,
your phone to
yeah, well,
remember what's going
I
on here.
actually I have so many friends in Kiev and around the country. I keep a couple of the sirens on just so I know, so I can text them and say, "Hey guys, are you doing okay?"
Yeah,
But so the I would say the principles of Western freedom and specifically the American tradition have always been very important to my background and to my family. There you go, Kherson, and it's lighting up.
it's growing up. Yeah, it's getting
Yeah,
by the minute, by the second, really.
the last 2 days or the last 3 days, I think, of shelling there have been yet another reminder that the Russians don't care, and they will.
Zaporizhia has been hit. Yeah, that's the nuclear power stations there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Sorry, on you go.
remarkable. No, no, not at all, not at all. So all these things coming from my background, I have I've worked on many documentary film projects. I've been involved in journalism in different forms here in the U.S. and related documentary work around Europe. So when the full scale invasion took place, it was very clear that we were in a really important moment. And at the start, it seemed as if everyone in the West was on track with support and with helping Ukraine to defeat Russia, not just as long as it takes, but to defeat Russia. But in America, there has been sort of a strange shift over the last year and a half, 2 years. And I think it actually was taking place before the war with a lot of the influence the Kremlin runs around things. But in America, a lot of the people who have been, I would say, champions of traditional values of freedom that have been displayed in the UK and in the US and in, I would say, our closest allied countries in Europe. A lot of these people who traditionally would be the champions of these things have become incredibly confused. And ultimately, what has happened is a lot of these folks have ended up supporting the narratives that come out of the Kremlin. So, one of the objectives of our work is to help Americans these folks I'm speaking of tend to be on the right of center. A lot of them are very concerned about issues like religious freedom and things like that. And so when you have these narratives coming out of the Kremlin of religious oppression and Orthodox Christians being this, and this makes it very confusing for them. And so you have a black and white issue, which is the invasion of a sovereign nation, the murder of its people, the torture of its people, and the attempted overthrow of their government, and also the the disregard of who they are as a people. So the Russians don't even think the Ukrainians are a thing. They think they're a small a small version of Russians, kind of the way they view Belarusians, but worse. So there's this moment that we have to be clear about. And so one of the objectives of our work is to help Americans be able to discern between Kremlin propaganda and truth, and also to share the hopeful stories which are coming out of Ukraine, because this is actually one of the biggest takeaways. The Ukrainians and Ukraine as a state has done something absolutely remarkable. They have, first of all, they are probably the most unified country in the world. This war, which, so Putin, when he invaded Ukraine, hoped to disintegrate the Ukrainian identity. What's happened is the opposite. He's Whatever hope he had of disintegrating the Ukrainian identity is lost now forever, because what's happened is the Ukrainians have become more unified in who they are than they were 10, 15 years ago. Ukraine has been on a journey since the fall of the Soviet Union. They've had, I would say, the Soviet hangover that a lot of these countries had, where, you know, 90 years, 80 years of Soviet oppression and the way the Soviets ran things, that held on in a lot of these countries once they got free of the Soviet Union. So different countries had it took different amounts of time for them to be able to break free of that. And Ukraine has been a sort of a thorn in the side of Russia for a really long time, that they could not have complete control over it. So this journey Ukraine has been on, I think, really came to full, I guess, blossoming, you could say, in February 24, 2022, because it was the line in the sand. If we had any questions before about where we stand with the West and with Europe and with Russia, those questions are gone now. Ukraine has put their flag in the ground and they are sticking by it. So in a time where people are confused about who they are, what their identity is, Americans are very confused. In a time where there is a lot of internal fighting, I know there is in America, and I've seen a lot of that in Europe as well. I think we can learn a lot from the way the Ukrainians have put aside internal bickers and come together about the things which really matter, which is their freedom, their faith, and the protection of their families. And they have done a remarkable job showing the world how to do that. And I think we can learn a lot from them.
So I think a lot of the problems in America is because Ukraine is a separate issue from what the mainstream media does on like any topic. And that's saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In a sense, so many people in America have been really hurt by the whole COVID and how that was done and treated, and the mainstream media was against a lot of those freedom-loving American. It really damaged a lot of businesses, mental health, and ongoing damage. And the trouble is, when you see the mainstream media reporting on a situation like Ukraine objectively, then that makes a lot of those people in America don't not believe something, and they think that the opposite would be true. So I think that's what a lot of the problem is. But Ukraine is not the people that did what. It's not Ukraine's fault. Like the mainstream media and the American government totally screwed up a lot of people's lives and businesses. It's not Ukraine's fault. People have to. That's the most important thing. Ukraine is a separate issue completely. So you have to be objective, and if people are not objective, it's just going to turn this weird state of American pro-Putinism into some sort of cult, and it's just going to wreck the relationship with America and Europe long term.
The issue with our our media, and I think media all over the world, is a really, really big issue. That is why true journalists and reporters and truthful storytellers are more important now than ever, because you're absolutely right. A lot of Americans, particularly, well, a lot of Americans on both sides of the aisle have had a very bad taste in their mouth. But I would say that's no excuse, because this war has proved to be maybe the best documented war, if not in history, of the last, I don't know, 50 years at least. 42 million Ukrainians, all with an iPhone, have been recording what's been taking place. And I mean, there have been fantastic publications and excellent coverage. Now, most of that has not come from America. Most of that has come from the UK or from France or from these other countries. One example is the Telegraph. They have done a tremendous job covering this. Again, I don't have a particular stake in that, and I don't know what their domestic story is, but in regards to coverage of the war, there's been some fantastic reporting. I think one thing which has really bothered me is that I think a lot of this response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, full scale invasion of Ukraine, has actually been, I think the mainstream media is an excuse because there are always shortcomings. It is true, it is worse now than it's probably ever been in our history. The factionalism in reporting. And this exactly what you said, which is the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's a great way to put that. I think on both sides there's great frustration. And to be honest, the way to use the common term, our mainstream media is run is incredibly factionalized, and it's often just reporting about the things we want to say, or just speaking about the things we want to say, or even not even reporting but commentating. So Americans have a bad taste in their mouth, but I would say that is no excuse for letting what is happening in Ukraine fall under the rug. It is everywhere. The reporting on it is everywhere. The stories are everywhere. What I have heard so many Americans say is, well, we just can't know. We're just not sure. What about this false flag? This? You've heard the Russians say this. What about that? And what is becoming more and more commonplace is sort of a rejection of first and basic principles. So instead of looking at what is taking place in the world and what is taking place in Europe and Ukraine from sort of a first principles stance, which is, okay, what is sovereignty? What is law? What is right and wrong on a very basic level? Instead of starting on those first principles, people bypass those and they go to whatever they are irritated about. So and the Kremlin is really, really good at diving into whatever the hot topics are in a specific country, specifically the United States, and then dividing people on that. So with a lot of the media campaigns they've done, even back long before the war. So, think back to when Oliver Stone did his documentary in 2019, where he sat down and he
Mm.
interviewed Putin, and Putin sort of gave the the playbook narrative of that which would end up becoming famous for why Ukraine really belonged to Russia and why everything was all the CIA and why Americans shouldn't care, and if they did care, why they should be in support of Russia. Well, that can I can fight you on that all day, and I can give you rebuffs for each one of those arguments. But when we sort of suspend our reason and when we suspend our understanding of law, that's when you can start falling into listening to those. If when I talk to folks on Ukraine, Americans who are when I talk to Americans who are confused about Ukraine, a lot of the things that comes up are, well, I heard there's religious persecution, or I heard there's corruption, or I heard this bad thing, or I had that bad thing. And they completely bypass the fact that this is a sovereign nation and a natural ally of Europe, which has been attacked by its much larger neighbor nation and which is attempting to conquer them. They completely bypass that. And again, all these narratives put out by the Kremlin are not true, and there are plenty of ways to rebut them. But even if a lot of these things were true, it still wouldn't matter. Russia would still be in the wrong. The the Nazi question is one which is it's remarkable to me how disconnected with the Russian way of viewing things Americans are, and then also how easily they've been walked into this. In Russia, there is a Putin sort of revitalized the sort of the neo-deification of the Red Army during the Second World War. And there's this understanding in Russia that the Red Army won the Second World War, and it's true there were allies, but the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, was actually a war between Russia, the Soviet Union, and the great evil Nazi state who was seeking to conquer everyone. Russia was a big part of the Second World War, but there is a massive inflated view of that in Russia, and that has been fed by the Putin government since, you know, the late 1990s and even a little bit before that. But specifically, the Putin government has really sought to revitalize that, and the actual history is completely left out. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact completely left out. The horrors that took place under Stalin completely left out, and this sanitized and I would say boost up on steroids narrative, the Soviet narrative, has been really revitalized. So when Russians talk about Nazis, they're not talking about Nazis the way we would talk about Nazis. When we talk about Nazis, generally, we're talking about Germans who are part of the Nazi party who fought in World War II. In Russia, a Nazi is kind of anyone who is against the Russian state in Europe. And there's no real definition of it. And there's no accurate definition of it. And so when Putin comes in here and says we're going after Nazis, there's this sort of fire which he tries to stir up in people, which is, this is the eternal fight we've been having. World War II never ended. It will always be us against the Nazis. And remember, there were all these Nazis in Ukraine. We're going after them again. That's one example of how, through concerted efforts over long periods of time, words have been defined into nothingness, and people have been the Russian people have been walked into believing this complete alternate reality story that is coming out of the Kremlin. Americans are very confused by this. And again, I think we have to go back to first principles, which is this a sovereign nation? Yes. Were they attacked? Yes. Are there people being bomb raped and killed to this day? Yes. Does Russia need to be defeated in Ukraine? Yes. I think when you keep those as sort of your base point, then you can go through and say, okay, well, how do we deal with this issue? How do we deal with this issue? Religious freedom is another one. So when I was in Ukraine doing our filming, I spoke with so many individuals from all different walks of life: the military, pastors, protesters, soldiers, doctors, every station in every job, expats, folks from America and the UK who had gone to Ukraine to help support them. And when I spoke to them about the issue of religious freedom, they all laughed as if it was a joke. I was in Armenian Orthodox churches, Roman Catholic churches, Ukrainian Orthodox churches, Russian Orthodox churches, Jewish synagogues. I spoke with Christians from every color and shape you can imagine, whether it's from, folks on the Protestant side of things or on the Orthodox or Catholic side of things. I spoke with Jews, with Muslims. And the one thing that they said across the board was Ukraine is one of the most religious free nations in Europe, if not the world. I spoke with people who said that was one of the greatest surprises when they moved to Ukraine. Not that Ukraine was so free on this issue, but that there was it was not even a second thought. So when Americans bring this narrative up that is put out by the Kremlin, you really have to break it down and you really have to understand what's going on. When the Kremlin says Ukrainians are persecuting Orthodox Christians, it's first of all just not true, and it's actually a complete switch around, because it is Kremlin-backed Orthodox priests who are torturing and killing Protestant Christians and Ukrainian Orthodox Christians. in Ukraine. It's the Russians doing it, not the Ukrainians. The Russian Orthodox Church, since the days of Stalin, has been heavily controlled by what was the KGB and then its successor, the FSB, which is just, again, a rebranding. And initially, when the Soviets went into Ukraine, as I'm sure you know, the Soviet state was an atheistic state, so religion was banned. And then Stalin realized, oh, actually, it might be helpful if we bring back the church. So when the Orthodox Church was again blessed by the Soviet state, it was so, but with this profound direction and influence of the then KGB. Well, after the fall of this, that was a defining part of Soviet life. Was if you're a priest, you must know that you have to be an informant on your people. And even some of my background, my father, he worked with sort of the underground Christian church in Russia before the fall of the Soviet Union. So understanding that history is really important, because the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church has continued to operate in that way. So, and you have to make a distinction between sort of your everyday Orthodox believer, Russian Orthodox believer, and then the leadership behind the Russian Orthodox Church. Kirill was a KGB agent, and actually, I interviewed just a couple days ago one of the folks who brought the documents out of the Kremlin, which had Kirill's history in it. This was, 30 years ago that this person did this, 25 years ago. So this manipulation of the Orthodox Church by the Kremlin has incredible precedent and a lot of history behind it, and it's just cropping up again in Ukraine. So when you're at war, when your neighbor is trying to wipe you off the face of the map, of course you're going to want to remove listening posts from within your capital and from all around your country. So when the Russians talk about Orthodox priests not being allowed to do X, Y, and Z, what is actually happening is these are the Ukrainians saying, we're not going to allow Russian agents to be reporting on us back to the Kremlin. So one other point I would make is the Russian Orthodox Church, according to their, I'm a Protestant, I'm an evangelical, so I have differences with a lot of the Eastern tradition, but the history and the ecclesiastical jurisdiction is incredibly important for them, and it's really important for Americans to understand, because it helps to figure out the defining issues around these questions. The Russian Orthodox Church was granted leadership over what is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church about 400 years ago by Constantinople, because according to their ecclesiastical jurisdiction, Constantinople grants that jurisdiction over them. That ended up being rescinded. But the Russian Orthodox Church continues to hold on to this idea that the Ukrainians are the lesser Russian, they're the lesser Orthodox Christians. We inherently have a right to have jurisdiction over them in both their government and in their church. Now, in the ecclesiastical side of the question, Constantinople, Istanbul today, but the church in Constantinople, which has that jurisdiction, rescinded that from Russia and then gave autocephaly to the Ukrainian church, which means that according to their ruling, the Ukrainian church is its own self-governing body, which answers to Constantinople and not to Russia. The Russians hate this because this undermines the idea of the Ukrainians just being small Russians. So what has quickly happened is, I think the Russians know that a lot of Americans, particularly on the right side of things, have a really tender heart about persecution of Christians and about religious freedom. And so this has been one of those places where there's been sort of a wedge pushed in between Americans to really bring up a lot of confusion here. There are thousands of Orthodox churches in Ukraine. There are hundreds and thousands of Protestant churches in Ukraine. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think it's something like 80 something percent or 75% of these, what had been called, well, churches which had fallen under the authority of of Moscow. Thousands of these churches switched over to Ukrainian authority because, I mean, how can you be asking blessings for the Russian patriarch in Moscow when he is physically blessing the tanks which are blowing up your homes and killing your brothers and sisters? So most Ukrainians you will meet with identify themselves as Orthodox Christians. It's an incredibly big part of Ukrainian culture, and it's a really, really important issue. So, th- Americans understanding the confusion which is being sowed by Russia on this issue is really important because this is like one of the defining parts of Ukrainian culture is their faith, is their Orthodox faith. So this is one example of the confusion which has been brought up, rather, which has been stoked by Moscow and which Americans have just walked into. Again, that was a little long winded, but one of the things you see anywhere you go in Ukraine is this remarkable freedom of people just to express their faith. And whether that's Roman Catholic, Orthodox Christian, Protestant, every other variation of anything you can imagine, that is all throughout Ukraine. And so the narrative which is being put out by Russia is one which is completely different from that which is actually taking place within Ukraine. And particularly now, as I think of the bill which is in the House, which is, in the balance for aid for Ukraine, this is one of those really important issues because a lot of these guys who have the deciding factor in our House for sending aid to Ukraine, a lot of these guys they're very nervous about religious persecution. And one of the things I would say to them is discern the difference between what is coming out of Moscow and what is actually taking place in Ukraine.
Yeah, these Americans really need to have first-person contacts in Ukraine and at least evangelical contacts in Ukraine from the east to get their view. And you have to ask a question: if they don't have these contacts, what are they basing their opinions on? Are they just
Right.
basing on, is it just laziness? And also, I'd ask them, if you have the money to travel and you have strong opinions about Ukraine, whether it's for or against, why don't you go to Ukraine and hook up with some people there and visit people and talk to people in the street? What's holding you back? It just seems like laziness to me to have this sort of LARP beliefs about Ukraine based on what you see on the coming from the Kremlin.
And the consequences of this are people are dying because of this foolish confusion. And it's not even just foolish, but it's sort of I feel like we're kind of losing our empathy. I feel like there are so many horrible things going around, we're just turning it down. And I people are dying and suffering because of this. I mentioned persecution of Christians by the Russian state and by the Russian Orthodox Church in occupied areas of Ukraine. The only denomination you can profess to be a part of is the Russian Orthodox Church underneath Moscow. There have been, I think, over 500 Protestant churches which have been destroyed or which have been taken over by the Russian military for their own purposes because they were Protestant. Many examples of Protestant pastors being tortured and killed because they are particularly identified with sort of American values. If you're Protestant, or rather particularly evangelicals, that is associated with Americans. So if you're a Ukrainian evangelical in an occupied zone, you're going to have a really hard time of it. A fellow by the name of Stephen Moore is doing a fantastic work from Ukraine. He's an American, but he has been a part of a work which has helped to bring light to a lot of the torture, execution, and suppression which has been taking place in Russian occupied zones. And he has an excellent site called Russians Torture Christians.org, I believe.
Right,
And
Russians.
Russia tortures Christians. And he has many examples of interviews of pastors up there. And he's not the only one. You can do a quick Google search and there will be many that come up. But this is a huge, huge issue. And Americans who should be the one, well, rather the folks who say they're the most worried about this are completely missing this. And instead, they're helping to give time to Putin and to aid Putin as he continues to do this, as he continues to fight in Ukraine and torture, kill, and destroy. So it's not only that we should care and we need to do something, but we need to do it now because we're 2 years into this war. I mean, humbly, I we could have, if we had come together and if our administration here in the United States, our presidential administration, had any kind of a clear objective for how to win and had any coherency. I mean, I surely we could have given the Ukrainians what they needed a year ago, a year and a half ago. And yet here we are 2 years later, and tens of thousands of people have died. Ukrainians have died, and Russians have died at the behest of Putin. I hear so many times from the Tucker Carlson crowd and from these other folks, you hear them talk about, well, Russians and Ukrainians are dying. It's very sad. As if there's nothing you can do about it. You can help the Ukrainians to win, and you can help them to win completely so that this stops now. But the longer we let this persist, first off, the worse it's going to be for the Ukrainians if they exist at all when this is over. And also, what happens is you are creating, rather, if we let this persist, we are creating an issue that will never go away. Because if there is a precedent set in Ukraine, all the other nations which are hostile to the Western tradition and which view us as the nemesis for whatever reason, they will view this as, okay, the West is disorganized and they don't care and they're not going to look after their own. Therefore, we can do whatever we want. And in America, the example which is raised very often is Taiwan, but the same is true for, I mean, Europe and the Baltics and for places all over the Indo-Pacific. So this war, this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which the war started 10 years ago, the full-scale invasion started 2 years ago. This is a test of Western will. Of Ukrainian will, yes, but of Western will. This, we can stand by our historic beliefs and principles, or we can let ourselves go quietly into the night. And it won't be just Ukraine which bears the consequences of that, which they will. It will be the rest of Europe and the rest of America and the world, because the implications of this are vast. One other comment I would make is there has been an attempt to sort of isolate this issue, which is the invasion of Ukraine. Back about a year ago, one of the things which were being said in America said in the crowds of people who just didn't want to hear about Ukraine anymore was there was this phrase which was passed around, which is, well, Ukraine is just a border spat. It's a border war. That's all they're fighting over. And this was one of these arguments, which, first of all, is not true, but is even more sinister because what is happening is you're getting people to say, well, it doesn't matter. Why does it matter and why should we care anyways? And when you have something as huge as this issue is made so, I mean, lied about in such a profound way, it has massive consequences. And we have to be able to discern between fact and between fiction. We have to wake up to the seriousness of this war in its present iteration right now. I mean, a couple minutes ago, we had an air raid siren on our phone go off. So it's taking place right now, and also its implications if we cannot come together and if we cannot unify in support for Ukraine to have total victory.
Yeah, now the whole of Ukraine is under the red alert.
There you go. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's. I mean, you can sort of sympathise with people in America because America to me seems like a very unfair society, and I guess a lot of people that are maybe suffering today is because they're of the sort of free market capitalism that Reagan brought in, because he basically allowed a lot of landlords to get ahead and things like that, and a lot of people are just trying to survive. So they're probably thinking, why should we spend 60 billion on goods when I can't even hardly feed my family or get an operation or something like that? So, but I can understand why these people might just not care. But the people that have the money or the funds and the success to then
I
still be like anti-Ukraine is, I don't
I
understand that.
understand. I understand what you mean. I would actually take a slightly different view of things. I think that the issue of supporting Ukraine as America, of Americans supporting Ukraine, I'm not talking about NATO or Europe or anything else, but specifically America. The issue has been turned into this question of, well, we send all this money to Ukraine, or we fix our border, and we take care of our own people. I think that is a I think that is a massive reinterpretation of how we should be viewing this. In America, folks on the right, which I would say I am on that side of things, um, folks on the right have been so fed up with our present administration for good reason that they disassociate themselves from anything that the Biden administration touches.
Yeah,
And what has happened is, again, this actually goes back to what I was saying before. Instead of people thinking from principle, they're thinking from the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so
exactly.
what's happened is the issue has been allowed to be defined as we help our people and we fix our border, or we help Ukraine, when that is just not true at all. The president of America is the president of the president of the United States is the president of the United States, and as that, historically has been one of the leaders of the free world. And I mean, we've seen this with many administrations in the past. Reagan is a great example. The president needs to have the bandwidth and the ability to deal with foreign and domestic issues. Now, regarding aid to Ukraine, the number you put on that is a different question. But our stance, as in total support for Ukraine to have victory, should be crystal clear. Now, I think it was almost like a coin toss as to whether or not the Biden administration was going to come out on the right end of things in regards to support of Ukraine. So I don't think there's any sort of coherent reasoning behind that beyond sort of a general, you know, sense that is articulated by the Biden administration. So I think there's been a massive failure in the way it pursues its support of Ukraine. But I think going back to the issue of sort of right of center support of things, we have just come out of 4 very unpleasant years of American administration. And the 4 years before that were incredibly chaotic. For whatever strengths President Trump had, he really facilitated a breakdown in communication and a breakdown in civility and decency. So he was able to accomplish some really remarkable things during his presidency. But what happened is that his supporters picked up on his own I, you know indecency and lack of presidential caring and lack of empathy, I think. And we can't allow that to happen. Now, the response has been to view our current administration, President Biden, as the opposite to the past administration. So it means that everybody who even vaguely supported President Trump when he was president now rushes to support him now because it's viewed as sort of this existential threat. We either get Biden again and the country goes up in flames, or we get Trump. And what's happened is we've laid aside our reasoning and we've laid aside our ability to speak to specific issues because it has become or it has been allowed to be interpreted as like this existential problem Americans have. America, in fact, can both deal with our issue on our southern border, which is massive, deal with our economy, and help support our allies. We absolutely can do that. It's bad leadership which has got us to the place we're in now. Authority can be given to the state governors and to the state national guards, and they can deal with those issues. Our economy, it will take time, but our economy can be adjusted and fixed. A lot of the issues we've had is from this completely chaotic administration of the last 4 years, and then also just the economies of the world. But to allow ourselves to have the issue defined as it is either everything that comes with the Biden administration and helping Ukraine, or it's fixing every single domestic problem we have and leaving them in the lurch. I think that is a massive mistake to define it that way. And again, what you said is really true. A lot of people are tired. A lot of people are worn out. A lot of people feel like they have been slapped in the face too many times. And the last couple of years have been incredibly difficult here in America, not just economically, but in, I would say, the common repartee has completely disintegrated, and people have become remarkably factionalized. But I think a lot of that responsibility actually falls on the weight of individual Americans as well, because I mean, we knew the kinds of things the Biden administration was going to promote when he was elected. That's not a surprise. But this, I would say, this sort of, I mean, people throw out the term lemmings, but it's true. This sort of factionalized tribal way of viewing everything is, I think, very unhealthy. And I think while that it is true that things have always had an element of groups, that's just the way a nation is formed. There are groups of people who have different ideas. I think we have come to a very, very low point in that now, to the place where we're no longer talking about ideas or principles or things we should stand by, but we're allowing who we are to be defined by very, very specific issues, which are red herrings to begin with, oftentimes. So, to finish this comment, Americans, under correct leadership, we can solve our own problems on the border and domestically and economically, and we can help our friends. The choice should not be defined Biden or Trump, this administration or that administration. The question should be what is right and what is wrong. And so many Americans have become so used to just siding with their party and just hoping their party gets it right because they agree with them on the most things, that they have stopped thinking from principle and from sort of first issues. If we can move back to first principles and to a civil way of discourse, I think we would be on a better track. And to be honest, I'm not inspired looking forward to our election ahead, as we have, again, President Trump in the running for the GOP, and as we have presumably Biden on. But I think there's going to be a change out at the last moment, because I don't think there's I don't think it's likely that he'll even be able to go for a next 4 years. The prospects ahead are not inspiring at all. But I think now is the time, if ever, now is the time to go back to first principles. Again, I bring up the whole Reagan question, because, well, not question, the people who view themselves as the inheritors of the Reagan administration, they are the, oftentimes, not all of them, and these are good people, they're just remarkably confused, and they're losing their empathy. They, on the one hand, they talk about the legacies of Reagan, but they don't think the way he showed Americans that we historically have thought. They don't think in this principled manner. They're invoking Reagan and the things they do. They talk about peace through strength, but a lot of these folks, and I know a lot of, or I know many folks who are in this camp, and then I know some folks who are in elected positions as this. A lot of these guys invoke this term peace through strength and the Reagan administration's theory of governing, but they're so caught up in the information war that they're not actually thinking from principle. So I would say think like a Churchill, even think like a Reagan, and think from principle, and less about just invoking things right and left, phrases. We are really, we're so used to shorthand here in the US. We need to stop and we need to think, okay, what are we about? What is America actually about? I think this factionalism and this breakdown of common discourse is a massive issue, and it's one of the main issues around main issues for confusion on the issue of Ukraine. So it's a big issue. Americans are going to have to deal with this, and it's going to get even more complicated as we go into this election cycle. But it's not one which is impossible. And I think we need to not allow the narrative and the the questions to be defined out of reality and out of a position of just war and just common law. We need to go back to, again, first principles.
I think that America was a lot more united after World War II. What do you think the main factors of the disunity that we see nowadays have came from?
I think you're absolutely right. At the end of the Second World War, well, you actually have to go back before the Second World War. So something which is really important to remember is in 1937, 1938, and 1939, there was actually a lot of support for the Nazi government in the United States, not for the Nazi ideology as it played out over the course of the war, but how it was perceived at the beginning. There was a lot of confusion. There was even factionalism then at this time in 1937, 38, and 39. And guys like Lindbergh, was a great American hero, he he championed what was then styled the America First movement. It's an old term, and he was a part of a lot of the confusion around the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany before America got into the war. So I mean, something to remember is the information battle we're having now with Russia is very, very similar, frighteningly so, to the information war that was taking place in America before we entered the Second World War. I mean, the issue of the annexation of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, people saying, oh, these are border wars, these are border spats. Why should we care? It's Europe. It's not our fault. Well, those guys are really Germans anyway. They speak German. Why should we care? It's not a big deal. A lot of the issues are frighteningly similar. Even the religious, the sort of, I would say, not the religious, but the moral high ground question. So in 1938, 1937, Hitler portrayed himself as the guy who was cleaning up the dirty town. He said, we're not going to have any more of these, we're not going to have immorality. We're going to clean up the brothels. We're going to clean up the clubs. Germany, rather, is going to be a leader in morality and in goodness and in cleanness, and we're going to lead the bright future, right? And a lot of people in America who had just been through the Depression, who had been through incredibly difficult times, saw that and were very enamored by that. And this idea of the strong man picking up the pieces and putting the country, which had fallen apart through despotism and immorality, that idea was very inspiring to
It's
them.
like Putin a bit.
Precisely, precisely. And a lot of Americans then were good people, but they were not thinking clearly on this issue. What did Putin say when he went into Ukraine? Well, what does Putin say about Russia, even as well? We're going to clean up the Nazis. We're going to restore the Russian speakers to the motherland. This isn't even a real country to begin with.
Yeah.
We have historical claim over its people and over its land. Its faith doesn't exist. Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, they're just Russian Orthodox. Ukrainians themselves, it's not real. Ukrainian the language, it's not real. It's made up. We're gonna get rid of the the we're gonna get rid of the immorality in Moscow. We're gonna clean this place up, just like we did in the early 2000s. It's gonna be all great, and we're gonna have this bright future. It's the narratives between Putin and between that early time in the Second World War after the Nazi Party had taken power are starkly similar, frighteningly so. Yeah, that was the air raid
The
siren.
raid is finished.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in Ukraine, I go to Ukraine probably a quarter of the time, plus ongoing, and you get the siren. It sounds different from the siren that's ended.
Mhm, mhm.
But every time you hear a siren, if you've sort of lived there, it sort of brings back some memories. It releases a bit of adrenaline. It depends
Absolutely.
how many bombs have fallen.
I remember I was standing in a cemetery, in Ukraine, and the air raid had been going so long that a couple of the sirens had turned off and it was quiet, but they hadn't turned on the air raid noise which announces the end of it.
Right.
And so we were standing in this cemetery. The sun was going down. It was peaceful. I had just finished an interview with this family about their son who had died. It was a very moving moment, and out of nowhere, the blare, and we were on the outskirts of this city, so there was a siren like a block from us, and the sheer amount of volume that came out of this thing was incredible. It was like the whole area around us was shaking. But it gets your heart rate going. I mean, again, these Ukrainians, they deal with this every single day. They are bombed somewhere in Ukraine every single day. This is not a static, quiet, stalemate war. This is going on real, real time right now before our eyes. And I mean, you've got the constant bombings in the West, and you have the little step by step death of a thousand cuts movements in the East. Again, we can we can do what needs to be done now, or we can sit on our hands again. Back to the Second World War question. I'm very cautious to make World War II analogies, just because I don't want to lessen the reality of the horror of the Second World War by comparing it with something present day. But I think that the lessons that were learned in the lead up to the Second World War are completely being forgotten now. And I think the parallels between the lead up to the Second World War and where we are today are quite frightening. Between the questions on religious freedom, between the American isolationist group, the same arguments they had are the arguments they're using now, which are, again, religious persecution. Why should we care? This person stands for moral clarity. Basically everything that Putin says is what was championed at the time. At the end of the Second World, and that's important to remember, because it was very chaotic before World War II in America. It was We were having incredibly difficult economic times. A massive amount of the population was out of work, and we were very disheartened. The Second World War brought us together, not because it was just a war, but because we were reminded about who we are and what we stand for. And we had an opportunity to play that out. And at times we did that imperfectly, at times we made big mistakes. But on the whole, the Second World War was an incredible moment for Americans to stand up and do the right thing. I would argue that the Second World War is probably the last legitimately declared and involved war that the US has been a part of. I have issues with almost every single military action we've had since then. Again,
Same here.
I know there are individual questions which need to be answered, but I think the Second World War is a remarkable example of a clear right and a clear wrong and a clear and rather an incredible example of Americans and Europe and the Brits, but specifically of Americans in my case, coming together to stand for something that actually matters in the moment when it matters. When the Second World War was over, every I think there was a brief moment where everyone thought, okay, we get a break. But then the rise of the Soviet Union, which had been neglected for 15 years because we were dealing with the war, and then before that, we weren't really sure what was going on, came to full blossom. So when we went into what would be called the Cold War, we were in sort of a tricky place because the peace that we thought we were going to have, we didn't have. And part of that came from our own mistakes, actually. Part of it came from Roosevelt and from Churchill playing with Stalin when they should have realized and should have seen what the kind of person Stalin was. I mean, you can just looking at the way the Russians treated their own people, the Soviets rather treated their own people during the Second World War. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but Ukrainians from the present borders of Ukraine are the largest ethnic group to have died in the Second World War. And some of the largest battles of the Second World War took place on present day Ukraine. Obviously, they had been consumed by the Soviet Union then, but the most deaths that came from Ukraine. And that habit of treating your own people like cannon fodder goes back to that time, and so we shouldn't be surprised by that. One other comment I'll make regarding this: there is and this sort of feeds into what we were speaking about before with why Americans, particularly on the right, view the war. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them, the vocal ones, I would say, the loud ones, are view the war in a they don't want to have anything to do with it. They don't want to hear about it. And Putin's not such a bad guy, anyways. That's basically how that goes. A lot of folks, when you try to connect the dots between the fall of the Soviet Union and the Putin being in power for the last 25 years, when you try to connect those dots, they don't like that because it has actually let's go back. When the Soviet Union fell, nobody thought it was going to happen. It took everybody by surprise. It had been disintegrating from within for a long time. When the Soviet Union fell, Americans thought, okay, it's over. We're done. We get to move on. The threat has been dispersed. Russians never had that experience. Russians never had the experience of sort of a rebirth after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was incredible economic difficulty and a lot of hardship that took place in the 1990s after the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin came to power largely through his ability to rally people and to say, hey, I'm going to be able to pick you up. I'm going to be able to give your dignity back. We're going to clean this place up. And one of the first places he started was in Chechnya. After Russia essentially lost the first Chechen war, Putin was able to go into Chechnya and to say, hey, first of all, we're strong. Remember those Red Army days? That's us. We can do it again. And see how tough we still are after these horrible economic times. So, by the way, if you want a foreshadowing of what is possible by the modern Russian army, look at what happened in Chechnya. It's worth a dive for your listeners to study that war a little bit, because a lot of the people who are in command of the Russian army today were in Chechnya, were associated with the horrors that took place there. So where Americans view the Soviet Union as sort of a distant past, Russians don't. Russians still view themselves as largely, that is, rather, still view themselves as being closely linked with that. So when Putin calls on this Soviet history, I mean, this some Americans may put that off as I don't know, just thinking about a quaint history. But when Putin talks about that history, he's talking about something which is very real and very alive to the Russians. So even as we've moved on since the Second World War, and since the fall of the Soviet Union and the perceived ending of the Cold War, the Russians haven't. I heard an interesting comment from one reporter, and he said that Americans tend not to think about Russia very often, or at least before the war. We didn't really think about Russia, but the Kremlin was always telling Russians to think about America. They're always the enemy. They're always against us. They're always coming after us. I have many Russian friends. I have many Ukrainian friends. There are many things which I love about Russian culture. There are many things which I find detestable and evil about things which are allowed to persist in Russian culture. I think that the Russian people as a whole have incredible traits of goodness in them, but I also think there is a darkness which is allowed to persist in the government, and it's fed down to the people. I think at the start of this war, I sort of perceived a lot of the Russian population as not necessarily being for Putin, but not willing to do a lot. I think that's still true. But I think what we've seen over the last year and a half specifically is that they're not just standing by, but a massive amount of the population is actually for what is taking place there. I've been bouncing all over the place, I know. But yeah.
It just seems like this, like it was in Nazi Germany. There wasn't enough people that would be willing to go up and risk getting killed to take out Hitler versus, in Russia, just you almost just need a few people in that circle or one person to stand up and take a shot at Putin, and that would
I
that would
mean,
solve a lot of the problems.
yeah, and I would say, even as I just said, there is incredible complacency in Russia in allowing this to persist. We have to remember the thousands of protesters which have been arrested in the last 2 years. This is something which I wish would get more coverage in America. Again, it goes back to, I think, the complacency of the American media. But there have been thousands of Russian protesters and of Russian dissidents who have been jailed, beaten, and sentenced to years in prison because of their opposition to this. The the sort of the playing of patty cakes with Putin as this sort of nice guy is disgusting to me, as you look at the descent into totalitarianism that Russia has been on in the last couple of years, but on like a rocket pack in the last 2 years. It is remarkable. You can't even say the word war in association with what is taking place in Ukraine without going to prison. You get truncheoned down for protesting anything in opposition to the Kremlin. And I think it is shocking that we still have people who are still kind of holding on to Putin's coattails in the West when the truth is before our eyes all the time. And again, there are real issues in the West, and I'm specifically speaking in America. There are major issues. And as an American and as somebody who studied our founding era and who cherishes that deeply and who genuinely believes America has been uniquely blessed by God, that those issues are vital to be fixed. But I think it is a massive mistake to leave our friends in the dust and set up a world of trouble in the future by essentially siding with Putin and what he is doing. I think history will not look kindly on us.
Well, Honor, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. That's I think you've had a really good pedigree of education to be such a young person and speak that much about what's going on and insightful. So,
It's
just
been a
wonder
pleasure.
if you've got anything else you wanted to share with us before we take to the next episode.
I really appreciate you inviting me on. I would, first of all, if I might, I would say check out my organization's website, ukrainestory.org. Again, we put up papers combating a lot of the propaganda that comes out of the Kremlin and speaking to issues, things like religious freedom, things like the issues surrounding America and its relationship to Europe and to Russia. We also, which is the most important part of this, help to tell the stories of Ukrainians in Ukraine right now, not just the pain that they're going through, but actually what we can learn from them, the remarkable, inspirational things which are taking place in Ukraine. So check that out if you like. Man, thank you so much for having me on. Yeah, it's been an honor.
Thanks, Honor, and we'll catch up in a few weeks or months, and when I'm back from Ukraine, and we'll keep in touch. And thanks everybody for watching the Nikos show today.
Lovely. Thanks so much, man.
See y'all.